This is the Your BIPOC Writing Coach podcast, and I'm your BIPOC writing coach, Lori L. Tharps. I'm a journalist and a former tenured college professor who moved to the south of Spain so I could live a global literary life. I'm also an award-winning author of both fiction and nonfiction who believes in the transformative power of a story well told. I created this podcast because I want to help as many BIPOC writers as possible get their stories out of their heads and into the world. Are you ready? Let's go. Hey, wordsmiths, storytellers, and scribes. Welcome back to Season 6 of the podcast, where we are all about our How to Be a Famous Author era. Yes, all season long, we are going to be talking about how to promote your work, building an author platform, and finding the fans who will buy, read, and support your work forever. This week, we're taking lessons from one of our literary ancestors who knew a thing or two about selling nonfiction books. We're talking about Mr. Frederick Douglass. You may think of Frederick Douglass as a great orator, a champion of civil rights, an advisor to the President of the United States, or maybe just that guy with the great hair. And all of those things are correct. However, we're going to be talking about Frederick Douglass, the literary superstar, the man who sold over 30,000 copies of his first book when technically he was still enslaved. Those sales numbers were neither accidental nor incidental. They were fully intentional because Frederick Douglass understood how to sell a book, how to make money from his books, and how to get subsequent book deals. So forget everything you think you know about Frederick Douglass, the historical figure, and let's learn what we can about Frederick Douglass, the writer, and dare I say, the Beyoncé of the 19th century literary world. Hello, everybody. Now, before we jump into Frederick Douglass's lessons for becoming a literary superstar, let's just do a quick refresh of who this man was. Even though he has long been one of my personal heroes, and fun fact, I actually met one of his descendants during my junior year abroad in Salamanca, Spain, and I almost lost my mind when I realized who I was talking to. But don't let me get off track. I just want to say, just because I have been obsessed with Frederick Douglass for a very long time, I don't assume everybody knows his full biography. So, in summation, Frederick Douglass was born Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey, yes, Bailey, not Douglas, in February 1818 in Talbot County, Maryland. He later chose February 14th as his birth date since his actual date of birth was unknown. He was born enslaved, and I don't need to go into the details. Slavery was terrible. It was miserable, painful, torturous. Everything you would think it was horrible. So much so that Douglass decided that he had to escape. And at age 20, he successfully escaped from Maryland by boat, dressed as a dock worker and carrying the free papers of another Black man. Frederick and his new wife, Anna Murray, eventually moved to New Bedford, Massachusetts, where they changed their last names to Douglass. They started a family, and Frederick started working in various different jobs as a laborer. But by his mid-20s, he had been drawn into the abolitionist movement because of his stellar speaking skills. And he began his career as a speaker on the abolitionist circuit. He was often, as you can assume, using his own harrowing experiences as a slave to drive home the need for abolition. Now, not surprisingly, he was such a good speaker that people in the audience, and when I say people, I mean mostly white people, started to question whether this Black man who was so eloquent, was such a good speaker, could have possibly been an actual slave. So they were really doubting. They were saying, he's making these things up. He's just acting. Those things didn't really happen to him. So Frederick decided he was going to write a book detailing the horrors of his early life to disprove the naysayers, to show what he actually lived through. And that's how Frederick Douglass begins his life as an author. To sum up his literary career, that first book where he was trying to challenge the naysayers was his famous The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass. That was released on May 1st, 1845. That memoir sold 5,000 copies within the first 4 months of its publication. Remember, that was in 1845. By 1850, over 30,000 copies. Yes, you heard me. 30,000 copies. That's 30,000 copies over 5 years sold. And the book had also been translated by that time into French and German. As an author, Douglass wrote 2 more memoirs. One was My Bondage, My Freedom, which was written in 1855. So that was 10 years later. And then he wrote 1 more memoir called The Life and Times of Frederick Douglass. That was towards the end of his life, published in 1881. Now, most people don't know this. I actually just learned this in doing this research, but Frederick Douglass also wrote a novella called The Heroic Slave, and it was based on the largest successful slave rebellion in the United States called the Creole Case. Look it up. It's fascinating. That novella was published in 1852. Douglass biographer Robert Levine said this about Frederick Douglass's writing career. He said, quote, "For Douglass, writing was action, as he saw early on in his career when his narrative galvanized abolitionists. This orator and activist believed that writing could change the world," unquote. Not only could it change the world, but it could change his life. Publishing his books changed Douglass's fortunes. As a best-selling author, Douglass was able to afford a stable and some might even say upper middle class existence. In 1877, Douglass bought a beautiful 21-room house sitting on a 15-acre estate in Southeast DC. Now, that house, I'm not saying that all of his money came from his books, but his book sales definitely contributed to his wealth. And he was able to live in that beautiful home until he died at age 77. So, like I said, Frederick Douglass knew a thing or two about writing good books, selling his books, and making a life from being a famous author. So let's look at Frederick Douglass's secrets for literary success. And I'm serious, you should be writing these down because these are tried and true formulas. And we can see that if they worked for Frederick Douglass, they could work for you. So let's break them down. Lesson number 1, first and foremost, you gotta write a super compelling book that has universal appeal and relevance that doesn't do the same thing as everybody else is doing. In other words, Frederick Douglass's first book, The Narrative of the Life, was very similar to a lot of other slave narratives. He was not the first person to publish his life story as a formerly enslaved person, but his book was considered one of the best. And some people say that the reason that Frederick Douglass's book was different is that unlike a lot of the other slave narratives of the time that were really just like documentation of what happened, one fact dropped on top of another, Frederick Douglass was more philosophical in his sharing of his story. One person wrote that his book forced the reader to ask themselves, what does it take for the human spirit to be free? So Frederick Douglass wrote a very compelling book that not only other Black people wanted to read, abolitionists wanted to read, but even people who weren't abolitionists but were just curious about what it was like to not only be enslaved, but to get free. These were some of the reviews of the time. I like to say this was like the 19th century version of a Goodreads review. So this is what one person wrote, and this was a man named Thomas Drew. He was a member of Christ Church. He wrote, quote, "The details of the writer absorbs all the attention, and Douglass was a mind bursting all bounds," unquote. Another Presbyterian minister wrote this about the book, quote, "Douglass is a literary wonder, such an intellectual phenomenon as only appears at times in the Republic of Letters," unquote. Pro tip, Douglass included these reviews in subsequent printings of the book. So the man knew how to promote his work. He actually got these quotes and made sure that they appeared in secondary and third printings of the book. So first and foremost, write a book that's unique, write a book that's compelling, write a book that people will want to talk about, will want to read and tell other people to read. So it starts out with writing a great book. Number 2, hit the road, for not a book tour, but a speaking tour, and sell your book as a keepsake for audiences. Don't make the tour about the book. Now, this is a very interesting idea. And it's, Frederick Douglass is, of course, not the first person to think about doing a speaking tour, but he used his book more like musicians use CDs and t-shirts and other swag for their concerts. You buy a ticket for the concert, you go watch the live concert, and then you're so geeked up after the concert, you just want to buy whatever the band is selling. Frederick Douglass did a similar thing. After touring the United States with his memoir the first time, Frederick actually had to leave the country because he was getting so popular touring around with his book that he was afraid that slave catchers were going to come and try to snatch him and sell him back down to slavery because technically he was still enslaved. So he decided to do a speaking tour in the United Kingdom. He took his books with him thinking that after he spoke, he would sell copies of the book. And let me be clear, he knew what he was doing was intentional to raise money. Like he fully expected that he would be able to finance his tour with sales of the book. And that's exactly what he did. Now, I want you all thinking, well, that was easy enough for Frederick Douglass because he had money or he had good friends. Let me tell you, Frederick Douglass at this point had 5 kids. He was still enslaved. He didn't have any money, not anything significant. He had a plan. And while he was very excited to be on the speaking circuit, one of his stated intentions was to make money. Yes, he did. And when people think, well, it was just easier for him because people wanted to hear him speak, or I don't know what you might think why it would be easy for Frederick Douglass or why he's different. But I want to just point out a couple of things about what Frederick Douglass was up against when he conceived of this idea to go on a speaking tour that people would pay money for and then buy his books. First of all, remember, he had 5 kids. He was a black man. He was still technically enslaved, so he could be captured at any point if he was still in the United States and sold back into slavery. 2, Frederick Douglass showed up in Ireland. That was the first stop on his UK tour, ready to sell some books. And guess what was happening at this time? If you know your history, Frederick Douglass arrived in Ireland for his big old speaking tour at the beginning of the Great Potato Famine. People were suffering, people were hungry, and yet he still got people to come and buy his book, to come and hear him speak. Now, here's something else that is really interesting and that should give you courage. First of all, remember, potato famine. Things are pretty harsh in Ireland at this point, and yet Frederick Douglass is still packing people in, standing room only, to come and hear him speak, and then they're so jazzed up about his speaking, they buy his book. Do you know what Frederick Douglass was talking about on the first leg of his tour in Ireland? He wasn't talking about slavery. He wasn't talking about abolition. Frederick Douglass was doing a speaking tour in Ireland about temperance. Yes, he came to Ireland and told these people they need to stop drinking so much alcohol, and that would help them. That would save them. Yes, Frederick Douglass was doing a speaking tour on temperance and selling his book, and was literally so popular. Women were just lining up to get his book. Men were lining up. And he was so popular that an Irish printer decided to create a Irish version, different from the US printing, and he had to go through multiple printings because they kept selling out of books. So that tour was super successful. The tour started in Ireland, and then he went on to England and Scotland. There was 9 printings that he went through over this 2-year period in the UK, and reportedly earned something like 750 pounds sterling, which according to my calculations would be about $160,000 in today's money. So Frederick Douglass understood the power of a speaking tour, making people excited to come and hear him speak, and then selling the book as a memento, if you will. And that's how he sold so many copies of his first book. Number 3. Consider international audiences to sell your work. If English is your first language, I want you to think about Africa, India, the Caribbean. There are so many other audiences who might be interested in your work. Again, Frederick Douglass wrote about his experience as an American who was enslaved, but was, killing it in Ireland. A lot of people in Ireland felt a deep solidarity for those people who were enslaved in the United States. So just understand that your audience isn't only in the United States or your country of origin. There may be other people who speak the same language in other countries who would also be interested, where you might consider doing a tour, if not a full tour, at least booking some events, because your audience, again, isn't necessarily only in your country of origin. Number 4. Be ready with a follow-up. Give your readers more of what they want. The success of Frederick Douglass's first book led other publishers to want to publish more from him. They wanted more. His readers wanted more. And so Douglass got to work and did a second memoir, My Bondage, My Freedom. And like I mentioned, he did a third one, The Life and Times of Frederick Douglass. Now, Frederick was obviously writing about more than just himself. He had a newspaper, the North Star. Like I mentioned before, he wrote a novella. Frederick Douglass was a writing fool. He was writing a lot, but he made sure that he knew what people wanted from him. They wanted more of his story because, again, his stature was growing. He was friends with President Lincoln. He was an advisor to subsequent presidents. He was an ambassador to Haiti. People wanted to know about this man, and he gave them more of what they wanted. 2 more memoirs. So give the people what they want. Number 5, show your face, get recognized, and build your public persona. In case you didn't know, Frederick Douglass was the most photographed American of the 19th century. Yes, more photographed than the United States President Abraham Lincoln. More than 160 photographs exist of Frederick Douglass. And remember, he was a wanted man, but that didn't stop him because Frederick Douglass was very intentional about crafting his own image. He wanted to contradict all of the insulting images that there were of Black people in America and wanted dignified images of Black men to counter those stereotypes. So he really understood the power of imagery. He literally was making a statement with his own image. But in so doing, he was creating the public persona that people wanted to meet. They wanted to know this man. And he did a good job. People were really thinking of him as a superstar. He was a celebrity in his own right. And a lot of that was by his own doing. Again, starting with the first thing, he had to be a man of substance. He wrote good books, but he also made himself a public figure that people wanted to support, wanted to be in his presence, willing to pay for his books, willing to pay to go hear him speak. So make that public persona. Let people see who you are. Number 6, practice good health to manage the stress of selling and being a public figure. According to one resource that I found, Frederick Douglass actually lifted weights every morning up through the final years of his life because even Frederick Douglass knew that exercise, regular exercise, was the key to making sure that he could keep doing what he was doing. And finally, last tip from Frederick Douglass is find a way to laugh, even in difficult times. I think it's really interesting and appropriate for where we are right now, what's happening in the world. Things feel really heavy. We might be witnessing the demise of the American experience, of American democracy. And it really can feel like there's no place for fun, for laughter, which is why I think it's particularly salient to be talking about Frederick Douglass as the literary ancestor to emulate. Frederick Douglass was literally selling his books, making speeches, fighting for the abolition of slavery, and then post-slavery, fighting for the rights of Black people to be treated as actual citizens, not to be lynched. He was living through such dark times of America. And yet, one of the techniques Frederick Douglass used in his speeches was humor. I, again, doing the research for this episode, found out that Frederick Douglass was actually quite funny and that he deliberately used humor in many of his speeches to get white people particularly to reconsider their thoughts about racism, to kind of trick them into thinking more deeply about their own perceptions of Black people. He often used jokes and role play and comedy to disarm his white audiences and then to kind of give them the 1-2 punch, if you will, to really reconsider their ideas and thoughts about slavery first and then Black humanity second. So he understood that humor works where browbeating or shaming people or even using his massive intellect might not work. So, final thought from Frederick Douglass was find a way to make people laugh even in difficult times. There you have it, people. There you have your tips for literary success from your 19th century literary superstars. Just to review really quickly: 1, write a super compelling book that has universal appeal. 2, hit the road for a speaking tour and sell your book as a keepsake. Don't make the speaking tour about the book. Number 3, consider international audiences who speak your same language to find other outlets to sell your work. 4, be ready with a follow-up. Give your readers more of what they want. 5, show your face and build your own public persona. 6, practice good health so you can stay healthy throughout your book tour. And 7, find a way to laugh. Help your audience laugh, even in difficult times. All right, people, I hope you feel inspired and excited to try some of these tips on your own book tours in the future. I hope they help you become a literary superstar. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Your BIPOC Writing Coach podcast. I hope you learned something new today and that you'll take something away from today's lesson about Frederick Douglass to help you lean into your famous author era. I'm going to leave you with this quote about Frederick Douglass by author and professor Emily Bernard. Frederick Douglass, quote, used his literary talents in the service of liberation. He was a writer first who did his thinking on the page, unquote. Remember what's possible, people, and be like Frederick Douglass. If you're looking for more creative writing inspiration and useful resources for your literary life, then be sure to check out the Read, Write, and Create website. That's at readwriteandcreate.com. Remember, it's REED, writeandcreate.com. It's your one-stop shop for inspiration and information to optimize your literary life. Wait, don't go yet. I really want to say thank you to an anonymous listener who bought me 10 cups of coffee on the Buy Me a Coffee app to help me purchase new equipment for the podcast. I made that request on our last episode of last season, and thank you so much, whoever that was. I appreciate you so much. You literally made my day, so thank you. And with just a few more donations, I will be able to buy that new mic and earphones for the show. If you feel compelled to buy me a coffee to show your appreciation for this solo indie podcast, the link is in the show notes. And remember, every coffee counts. The Your BIPOC Writing Coach podcast is written and produced by me, Lori L. Tharps. Our editor is Brad Linder, and our theme music is by Wataboy. Until next week, people, keep writing. The world needs more BIPOC stories written by BIPOC storytellers just like you.